River Charter School with This Week in History, specifically the week of August 30th through September the 5th. Well, we have kind of the alpha and the omega this particular week, the beginning and the end of World War II. So we start off with on September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., a German battleship that just 5 days earlier had visited this particular Polish port to make a courtesy call, opened fire on a Polish fortress. Thus began World War II. Hitler followed a well-dog-eared playbook that had been used before. He rattled his saber at the Poles just as he had the Austrians and the Czechs before. He claimed that ethnic Germans were being oppressed and were crying out for his protection. Hitler always liked to look for ways to make his aggression justifiable. Therefore, on August 31st, near the German-Polish border town of Gleiwitz, German operatives selected this particular radio station. They went in, put on a recording of very anti-German propaganda in Polish. Now, they also, the station then went off the air. Then, the prisoners from a nearby Dachau concentration camp, who had been dressed in Polish army uniforms, were executed and their bodies scattered around the radio station to make it look like a firefight had occurred and the brave German soldiers had fought off the Polish aggressors. Now, the German authorities made darn sure that the photographers were there at first light to take the photographs to make sure they made the German papers that day to alert the German people. As Hitler put it, he had no choice but to end this lunacy. And on September 1st, after that German battleship opened up, 1.5 million German troops came across the border into Poland. This is generally considered to be the beginning of World War II. Between the Germans and the Soviets, Poland would not be free until 1989. Well, on September the 2nd, so literally 6 years plus 1 day, September the 2nd of 1945, World War II came to an end. In this case, you have the Japanese surrender delegation on board the battleship USS Missouri in order to sign the paperwork. What is amazing is the tenacity of the Japanese people. Even though they were starving from a naval blockade, just about every major Japanese city had been burned to ground by firebombing and 2 atomic bombs. The Japanese government was far from certain as far as surrender goes just 2 weeks before this photograph was taken. Now, plans for the defense of Japan, which had not been successfully invaded in its 3,000-year history, involved whatever military was left, but also essentially turning the civilian population, women and children included, into basically kamikazes. There was no discussion of surrender whatsoever after the Hiroshima bomb. Now, after the Nagasaki bomb, the Japanese War Cabinet did meet, and they voted on whether or not to continue fighting or to talk, and it was a tie vote. The emperor cast the tie-breaking vote in favor of it's time to surrender. Now, the emperor decided to make a recording that would be broadcast over Japanese radio and over loudspeakers and put up as billboards for people to read all over the place. But even then, a group of officers tried to seize the recordings before they could be played. Their idea was then to sort of secret away the emperor and try to talk some sense into him. Fortunately, the emperor's broadcast did go off. The emperor, of course, was considered to be a living god. This was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard the voice of their emperor. He even spoke in a dialect of Japanese that was only spoken by royalty and nobility, so somebody had to translate it. Fortunately, his broadcast had the intended effect on the citizenry and the military of Japan. Now, we didn't know whether the atomic bombs were going to work really until they were used. So until the time the Japanese decided to surrender, we were still planning with our allies the invasion of Japan. The name of the overall plan was Operation Downfall. But because of our experiences on Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Okinawa, the prospect of invading the home islands was quite daunting. In anticipation of the carnage, the War Department, now if you remember last week I showed you this medal, the Purple Heart. And I mean, this one right here. In anticipation of the carnage, the War Department ordered 500,000 Purple Hearts to be minted. These would be handed out to the casualty. If you're wounded in combat, you receive a Purple Heart. Well, fortunately, they weren't needed for the invasion of Japan, but from 1945 until today, every Purple Heart that has been handed out has been one of the 500,000 that was minted for the invasion of Japan. It is estimated there are approximately 110,000 left in stock. So, the end of World War II. I was fortunate enough to get to know a man that was a Navy diver. And he related an experience that occurred. He said he didn't really realize the significance of it until many years later. He was in Manila, the Philippines, when on August the 15th, they received an order to go down to the docks, and that any person who was not on a specific duty was to help unload several cargo ships that had come in. He said he didn't really realize exactly what he was doing until the next day, on the 16th, when they heard that the Japanese had announced they were going to surrender, and that the war was over. And then it hit him that the significance of what he had done. That day, he helped unload 125,000 body bags, all, again, intended for the invasion of Japan. So, thank God we didn't have to do that. Well, that's it for this week, but to let you know what's coming up next week, we will take a look at a very important day in this man's life. Thank you very much. I'm Carl Lang, Brazos River Charter School, and we look forward to seeing you right here next week.